Ladies and gentlemen, as chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this, the inaugural Keith Joseph Memorial Lecture, and in particular to thank the Swiss Bank Corporation for their magnificent hospitality. Keith Joseph was a great man. He was one of the outstanding thinkers and men of affairs this century. He loved ideas and he loved politics. And to him, these two worlds were closely related. Whether the subject was controlling inflation, raising standards in schools, strengthening the family, or questioning a European currency, Keith was convinced that one needed a firm intellectual foundation on which to develop effective and lasting policies. He was an extraordinarily clear thinker and submitted all new ideas to the most rigorous of tests, always being sure to consult the views of those with first-hand knowledge and experience of the particular field. It was because of this that, along with Margaret Thatcher, he founded the Centre for Policy Studies. After the defeat of the Conservative government in 1974, the CPS was set up to think through the basis of modern conservatism and the policies needed to give it effect. The result has been a way of thinking and a series of policy initiatives which have had a profound effect on this country and abroad. Keith was devoted to the CPS. He rejoined the board in 1991, and even after his illness, rarely missed a meeting. He was, of course, always accompanied by his beloved Yolanda, and it is a particular that Yolanda is here this evening, along with his two daughters, Anna and Emma. Thank you, Yolanda. In recognition of Keith's outstanding service, the directors of the CPS decided to establish the Keith Joseph Memorial Lecture. There was, as you can imagine, never any doubt about who should give it. It's my very great pleasure this evening to introduce Lady Thatcher, co-founder with Keith of the Centre, a great British Prime Minister, and one of the most outstanding world leaders of the 20th century, to give the first lecture. Margaret. Very well.
Yes, thank you very much. My Lord Chairman, Lady Joseph, ladies and gentlemen, Keith Joseph, in whose honor this lecture is delivered, had the charm of 100 paradoxes. He was a modest man, but unlike so many modest men, he really had nothing to be modest about. He was that overworked, but in this case appropriate word, brilliant. Yet he never indulged in intellectual virtuosity. He was brave, yet by nature he was timid. He could seem cerebral and remote, but he had a warm heart and impish humor that made his friendship an inexpressible delight. Keith was also unusual in that even when quite old and frail, he seemed somehow to remain young. The secret of this youthful spirit was the opposite to that of Faust, for in Keith's case, it was a fruit of innocence. Not the innocence of inexperience, let alone of insensitivity. This was the innocence of the pure in heart, of those who have wrestled with the evils of humanity while remaining unspotted by the world. Keith's goodness was shown by the little kindnesses which marked his dealings, both with political friends and opponents. He had no enemies. But Keith was more than good. He was also great, and his greatness lay in his integrity. Integrity is an old-fashioned word. There are even some who will tell you it's an old-fashioned thing. But for a politician, integrity is everything. It's not just a matter of avoiding bribes and inducements. In our remarkably financially honest British politics, it is not even mainly about that, whatever learned judges may say about the matter. In politics, integrity rarely lies in the conviction that it's only on the basis of truth that power should be won, or indeed can be worth winning. It lies in an unswerving belief that you have to be right. It was not that Keith wore a hair shirt from preference. He was averse to any kind of suffering, especially other people's, and applying the right remedies to the British disease was bound to require suffering. But Keith's integrity was absolute. When he became convinced, finally convinced, after the endless discussions which were a mark of his open-minded, open-hearted style, that a proposition was correct, he felt he had to defend it. He had to fight for it. When he faced those raging, spitting, Trotskyite crowds at our great liberal centers of learning, I suspect he wondered sometimes whether he would have to die for it. But there he stood. He could do no other. This lecture is not, however, intended as a eulogy. The purpose of recalling the turbulent times of 20 years ago, when Keith Joseph and I reshaped conservatism with the help of a handful of others whose dedication compensated for their fewness, is that the same qualities as Keith's are required in our party today. Keith Joseph's name will always be closely associated with the rethinking of conservative principles and policies in preparation for the Conservative government of the 1980s. You will recall that the party was out of office, having lost the February 1974 election, when Keith began delivering in the summer and autumn a series of speeches analyzing what had gone wrong and suggesting a change of direction. In June came the Upminster speech. Keith dared to talk about what he called the inherent contradictions of the mixed economy. This, in the eyes of the Tory establishment, whose only real criticism of the socialists was that they were mixing the economy in the wrong proportions, was bad enough. But it was the Preston speech in September, delivered almost on the eve of a second general election, which most horrified Keith's critics. In it, he dared to tell the truth about inflation. And that truth was inevitably damning for the previous Conservative government, of which he and I had been a part. Inflation was properly to be ascribed to the excessive growth of the money supply. And since, as Keith devastatingly observed, there was a time lag of as much as a year or two between the monetary cause and the inflationary effect, the high inflation of the summer of 1974, 17% and rising, was the responsibility of the Conservatives. Keith also rightly noted that the root of the Conservative government's failure to control inflation was fear of unemployment. But as he and I would go on to argue on other occasions, unemployment was not an alternative to inflation, but one result of it. Ever higher doses of inflation were required in order to have even a short-term effect on jobs. And in the longer term, inflation undermined confidence, pushed up wage costs, promoted inefficiency, and aborted new employment. For saying such things, Keith was publicly ridiculed and privately vilified. His colleagues accused him of disloyalty, splitting the party, and so on. Those whom Hayek had described as the socialists of all parties united to denounce him. For Keith, in their eyes, was demonstrating the worst possible seamanship. He was rocking the boat. But in fact, it was Keith's compass that was true, and it was the boat that was already adrift and threatened by total shipwreck. Most of the economic analysis which Keith Joseph offered has since been accepted. But Keith was not only or even primarily interested in economics. It was simply that in the 1970s, economics had gone so devastatingly wrong that this was where any new analysis had to focus. Indeed, that remained true to a large extent in the 1980s. Reversing Britain's economic decline was such a huge and painful undertaking that at least until the later years, the economy had to come first. Keith himself, though, was even more interested in social than in economic issues. He'd come into politics not from personal ambition, but from an idealistic urge to diminish the misery of poverty. But his one foray at this time into rethinking social policy in the form of the Edgbaston speech went badly wrong. In fact, though flawed in some respects, the speech, with its emphasis on remoralizing society and on strengthening the family, deserves rereading. It does not, though, reveal much about his essential philosophy, which with Keith, as with most professional politicians, remained below the surface. The kind of conservatism which he and I, though coming from very different backgrounds, favored, would be best described as liberal in the old-fashioned sense. And I mean the liberalism of Mr. Gladstone, not of the latter-day collectivists. That is to say, we placed far greater confidence in individuals, families, businesses, and neighborhoods than in the state. But the view which became an orthodoxy in the early part of this century and a dogma by the middle of it was that the story of human progress in the modern world was the story of increasing state power. Progressive legislation and political movements were assumed to be the ones which extended the intervention of government. It was in revolt against this trend and the policies it bred that Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, which had such a great effect upon me when I first read it, and a greater effect still when Keith suggested that I go deeper into Hayek's other writings. Hayek wrote, "How sharp a break with the whole evolution of Western civilization the modern trend towards socialism means becomes clear if we consider it not merely against the background of the 19th century, but in a longer historical perspective. We are rapidly abandoning not the views merely of Cobden and Bright, of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and the Romans. Not merely 19th and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Erasmus and Montaigne, from Cicero and Tacitus, Pericles and Thucydides, is being progressively relinquished." Those were Hayek's words. So, ladies and gentlemen, against that background, it's not surprising that the left claimed all the arguments of principle and that all that remained to the right were the arguments of accountancy, essentially when and how socialism could be afforded. It was this fundamental weakness at the heart of conservatism which ensured that even conservative politicians regarded themselves as destined merely to manage a steady shift to some kind of socialist state. This was what, under Keith's tuition, we came to call the ratchet effect. But all that was not just bad politics. It was false philosophy and counterfeit history. Let me remind you why this is so. Creativity is necessarily a quality which pertains to individuals. Indeed, perhaps the one immutable law of anthropology is that we are all different. Now, of course, individuals can't fulfill their potential without a society in which to do so. And to set the record straight, once again, I have never minimized the importance of society, only contested the assumption that society means the state rather than other people. Conservatives do not take an extreme, atomistic view of society. We need no lectures now, or at any other time, about the importance of custom, convention, tradition, belief, national institutions, or what the ancient Romans would describe as piety. Nor do we dispute that the bonds of society need ultimately to be guaranteed by the state. It is Marxists, my friends, not conservatives, who imagined, or at least pretended to imagine, that the state would wither away. No, what marks out our conservative vision is the insight that the state, government, only underpins the conditions for a prosperous and fulfilling life. It does not generate them. Moreover, the very existence of this state, with its huge capacity for evil, is a potential threat to all the moral, cultural, social, and economic benefits of freedom. States, societies, and economies which allow the distinctive talents of individuals to flourish, themselves also flourish. Those which dwarf, crush, distort, manipulate, or ignore them cannot progress. Those eras in which a high value has been placed on the individual are the ones which have known the greatest advances. By contrast, although the great monolithic states, empires, and systems can produce impressive monuments and a high level of cultural sophistication, they are not able to mobilize the initiative of their populations to ensure that each generation can expect a better life than its predecessor. It's only Western civilization that has discovered the secret of continual progress. This is because only Western civilization has developed a culture in which individuals matter, a society in which private property is secure, and a political system in which a range of competing views and interests is accommodated. The moral foundation of this system, which is so spontaneous as hardly to seem a system, is the Judeo-Christian outlook. The system's institutional foundation is the rule of law. Expressed like this, it all sounds very abstract. But we in Britain are extraordinarily, indeed uniquely lucky, because with us, these things have become second nature and a way of life. Over the centuries, the habits of freedom became ever more established in these islands. They and the institutions which came to embody them, independent courts, the common law, above all Parliament, were in a special sense democratized. That is, they came to be regarded as the birthright, not of any class or group, but of the nation as a whole. In a more doctrinal form, they have found their way into the Constitution of the United States. All this meant that when Keith and I were struggling to shift Britain back from the socialist state, we were also acting as conservatives, with a small c. We were seeking to re-establish an understanding of the fundamental truths which had made Western life, British life, and the life of the English-speaking peoples what they were. This was the foundation of our conservative revolution. It remains the foundation for any successful conservative program of government. And that is the first lesson which needs to be drawn from the rethinking of conservatism, which Keith inspired and led. The principles which he restated and which formed the basis of the policies the Conservative government pursued while I was Prime Minister are as true and as relevant now as they were 2 decades ago, or indeed, give or take a little economics, 2 centuries ago. The cause of limited government, in which the state is servant, not master, custodian, not collaborator, umpire, not player, is the one beneath whose standard Keith Joseph and I gathered all those years ago. It's time to take it out of mothballs, brush off the odd collectivist cobweb that's hung onto it, and go forth to meet the foe. A second lesson is that avoiding debate about the large issues of government and politics leads to directionless failure. Being prepared to state uncomfortable truths, as Keith insisted in doing, is the precondition for success. It is extremely doubtful whether the Conservative Party lost support because of Keith's controversial Preston speech in September 1974. But I'm quite sure that without it, we would never have embraced the approach that yielded first victory in 1979 and then a remarkable string of achievements in the years which followed. Splits and disagreements over important issues never did a party so much harm as the absence of honest, principled debate. There is, however, one apparent lesson that we would be most unwise to draw. That is the suggestion, which one hears from time to time, that the only hope for the Conservative Party is a period in opposition. The situation today in the party is entirely different from that in 1974, when Keith was making his great speeches. In the present Prime Minister, the party has a leader who shares the broad analysis that Keith Joseph and I put forward. Of course, it's no secret that between John Major and me, there have been differences on occasion. But these have always been differences about how to achieve objectives rather than what those objectives should be. What is required now is to ensure that those objectives are clearly explained so that a re-elected Conservative government can go further towards fulfilling them. My friends, the attractions of opposition are greatly exaggerated by those who have not experienced it. But judging from the opinion polls, opposition is where the electorate is at present inclined to send us. For a variety of reasons, which I shall describe shortly, I believe that this would be ill-judged on their part. The Conservative Party still has much to offer, and from Mr. Blair's new, or not so new, Labour Party, there is much to fear. But we mustn't ignore the present discontent. Some of it is more or less inevitable. A constant struggle is required to ensure that long-serving governments don't run out of steam. I always regarded it as necessary to combine my role as Prime Minister with that of Chief Stoker so as to keep up the pressure. It is also true that the political world is more complicated than in the 1980s. The sharp divide between the forces of freedom represented by the Conservative Party in the West on one hand and the forces of collectivism represented by the Labour Party and the Soviet bloc on the other, that sharp divide is a thing of the past. The extent of the success we achieved in the 1980s has, in this sense, caught up with us. That may be politically inconvenient, but I, for one, would not change it. During most of my political life, freedom in this country was under a direct challenge from fellow travelling socialists and an aggressive Soviet Union. These challenges were overcome because the Conservative Party in Britain and other right-of-centre parties elsewhere, under the international leadership of Ronald Reagan, proved too much for them. The fashionable expression is that communism, and indeed socialism, imploded. If that means that their system was always unviable, so be it. Though many of the people who now say this scarcely seem to believe it true before the implosion occurred. But anyway, let's not forget that the system collapsed because it was squeezed by the pressure that we on the right, I repeat, on the right of politics applied. 3 cheers for Dennis. And the left should not be allowed to get away with pretending otherwise. But of course in politics, there is only gratitude for benefits yet to be received. That is why, however successful they prove to be, governments and parties have to keep on reapplying their enduring principles to new circumstances. The Conservative Party today has problems, not because our analysis has been wrong or our principles faulty. Our difficulties are due to the fact that in certain limited but important respects, our policies and performance have not lived up to our analysis and principles. That's why the current idea, put around by some malcontents, that the Conservative Party is in trouble because it has moved to the right, and that this is what needs to be remedied, is baloney. And Dennis might be able to suggest a still more telling description. The test is simple. Just ask yourself, is it because the government has not spent, borrowed and taxed enough that people are discontented? Or is it that we have gone too far towards increasing government spending, borrowing and taxation? The answer is obvious. We are unpopular, above all because the middle classes and all those who aspire to join the middle classes feel that they no longer have the incentives and opportunities they expect from a Conservative government. I'm not sure what is meant by those who say that the party should return to something called one nation conservatism. As far as I can tell, by their views on European federalism, such people's creed would be better described as no nation conservatism. And certainly anyone who believes that salvation is to be found further away from the basic conservative principles which prevailed in the 1980s, small government, a property-owning democracy, tax cuts, deregulation and national sovereignty, is profoundly mistaken. That mistake in most cases has its origins in the acceptance of the picture of the 1980s which has been painted by the critics. That decade changed the decoration of Britain to such an extent that it is unlikely that even a Labour government would altogether reverse it, try as they might. Inflation was brought down without the use of the prices and incomes controls, which the great and the good all agreed were indispensable. Public spending as a share of GDP fell, which allowed tax rates to be cut, and government borrowing was reduced. We repaid debt. 364 economists who claimed that it was madness to think you could get economic growth by cutting government borrowing were proved wrong. I'm told they were never the same again. Reform of the public finances was matched by reform of the trade unions, deregulation and privatization of industries, and a great extension of ownership of houses, shares and savings. Quite a lot of stakeholding, in fact. The economic growth and the improvement of living standards which resulted from these reforms were so great that for a time materialism, rather than poverty, became the main accusation against us. Hunting the yuppie became the favourite sport of the neo-Puritan liverish left. But of course, the reality was that the success which free enterprise brought over those years was not just expressed in conspicuous consumption, though what would we give for a few more of those yuppies today? It also allowed a doubling, that's over and above inflation, a doubling of voluntary giving to good causes. Moreover, though we made mistakes of financial management by allowing the economy to overheat and inflation to rise towards the end of that period, the general advance of prosperity was solidly based upon real economic improvements. Above all, there was a rapid and sustained rise in industrial productivity which has continued. And as a result of the control of public expenditure over those years, particularly the reining back of future commitments on pensions, Britain advances towards the next millennium with a large advantage over our European competitors as regards taxation and costs. The message from all this is not that everything in the 1980s was perfect, or that everything that has followed in the 1990s has been bad. Every Prime Minister has his and her regrets. The important message, rather, is that in Britain we have seen from the 1980s what works, just as we saw in the 1970s what did not. And what works here, as elsewhere, is free enterprise and not big government. So it would make no economic sense at all for us to move closer to the policies of our opponents. Rather, the economic challenge is to cut back the burden of state spending, borrowing and taxation still further. And trying to move towards the centre ground makes no political sense either. As Keith used to remind us, it's not the centre ground, but the common ground, the shared instincts and traditions of the British people, on which we should pitch our tents. That ground is solid, whereas the centre ground is as slippery as the spin doctors who have colonized it. Ladies and gentlemen, one of Keith Joseph's most admirable characteristics, and one which secured for him respect and affection, was that he never cast doubt on the motives of his opponent. So, following in his footsteps, I'm not going to cast doubt on the motives of the leader of the opposition. But what about the party he leads? The Labour Party itself may have changed many of its policies, but it hasn't changed its spots. You can tell this from the unpleasant noises it makes when anything like profits are mentioned. There is still virtually nothing that Labour spokesmen wouldn't spend more taxpayers' money on or wish to control more tightly. They have learned to accompany these prescriptions with conservative-sounding rhetoric and even some conservative-sounding policies. But the distinctive mark of every Labour policy, from health to education, from privatised utilities to the labour market, is more government interference. All sorts of worthy people believe that Mr. Blair in office would control his party, and not they him. But this would be a large gamble to take. Moreover, Mr. Blair is not only human, he is also, as his record shows, by instinct a man of the left. Confronted with the sort of choices you face in government, decisions which often go unmentioned in manifestos, it is the Prime Minister's gut instincts which count. The pressures to solve problems and assuage demands by more public spending, intervention and controls can become almost irresistible, even for an instinctive free marketeer. Mr. Blair may believe with his head that government spending is not the universal panacea. But what about his heart, and indeed his gut? In any case, government is not about generalities, but about specifics. Only if you have the conviction, the conservative conviction, that it is wrong to spend more taxpayers' money unless the reasons for doing so are overwhelming, and even if then you can't sleep easily after doing so, are you likely as Prime Minister to face down the pressure? Suspicions that a Labour government would in practice become too soft a touch on public spending are compounded by all the misty talk about boosting communities and community values. Now, communities can be sustained in two ways only, either by the state, which is what community politics, community leaders, community health, community housing, community centres, and so on, ultimately rely on, or communities can be based on genuine volunteers, sometimes local businesses, sometimes individuals with a common, freely chosen goal, like those who founded the great voluntary movements of the Victorian era, which are still with us. In some cases, to be sure, the state, often in the form of local government, can play a modestly useful part in community projects. But the risk is that community comes to mean collective. Collective comes to mean state. And thus the state expands to replace individual effort with subsidized activism. It is free, enterprising, self-reliant, responsible individuals that Britain needs. It's when we have more of them that our communities will take better care of themselves. But I believe there's a still more important reason why Labour should not be entrusted with government. They may protest that they're no longer socialists, but they have lost none of their zeal for constitutional upheaval. The Labour Party's proposals on devolution threaten chaos and possibly the dissolution of the Union of the United Kingdom itself. Moreover, by embracing European federalism through the European Social Chapter and above all the European single currency, a Labour government could deal a terminal blow to the traditions of British parliamentary democracy. Traditionally, the socialists believe that the state must make people equal, though an honest look at the perks and privileges of the communist nomenclatura might have set them right about that. The New Look Labour Party now apparently wants the state to make people high-minded and socially aware, though a thought for how difficult the churches find it to change people's behaviour ought to induce some doubts when mere politicians start to preach. It seems to me that New Labour has a new song, one that was made famous by Dame Vera Lynn. Wishing will make it so. Just keep on wishing and cares will go. And if you wish long enough, wish strong enough, you will come to know. Wishing will make it so. But it won't, any more than you can make people good by legislation. So the limitation of government is still the great issue of British politics, and indeed to a remarkable degree of global politics. The threat to limited government did not end with the collapse of communism and the discrediting of socialism. It remains an issue in Western, particularly European democracies. There is a constant tendency in which the pressure groups, vested interests, and the media play a part for government to expand. One of Thatcher's laws, for which I owe something to Lord Acton, is that all government tends to expand, and socialist government expands absolutely. If you start with their view of the state, that it exists to right social wrongs rather than to create a framework for freedom, you can never find the definitive justification for saying no. Above all, you can't say no to demands for more spending on welfare. That's why in Sweden, the share of national income the government took reached some 70%. It's why it's several points higher in Europe on average than here. The dominant political philosophies of those countries have been socialist or social democrat or Christian democrat. All of them views which hold that the state, rather than individuals, is ultimately responsible for what happens in society. All of those views have led to an increasing expansion of the state. So the limitation of government is still the great issue of British politics. This is in very marked contrast to what has happened in the United States, which even when the Democratic Party is in charge, has never been converted to the idea that government, let alone the federal government, has the right to intervene whenever it wants. It is also in marked contrast to those Asia-Pacific countries like Hong Kong, the Little Tigers, and of course the mighty Japan, where government share of GDP remains very low. Government spending at just over a third of GDP in the United States and a quarter or less in the Asia-Pacific has resulted in low taxes and high growth rates. Their example, like that of Britain in the 1980s, shows what works, just as the overspent and overregulated Scandinavian model shows what does not. It was with the best intent that post-war governments spent more on welfare, believing that as the standard of living rose, people would do more to look after themselves. What we had to do, as Keith often said in earlier years, was to break the cycle of deprivation. But the more we spent, the greater the dependency, illegitimacy, and crime became. And of course, the tax burden rose. Western countries have now woken up to the problem, but they are still paralyzed by it. Here, though, Peter Lilly has been advancing steadily with social security reform, making important changes to reduce future burdens. Yet, as Peter himself often reminds us, social security still accounts for over 40% of central government spending and costs every working person £15 every working day. Certainly, the proposals increasingly favoured by the Labour Party for a much higher compulsory second pension, paid for by much higher compulsory contributions, offer no way out. It is one thing, my friends, to encourage people to make provision for themselves, as we do with housing, health and pensions. It is also acceptable in some cases to ensure that people make some minimum contribution towards benefits, as we do through the national insurance system. But the Labour Party's plans would involve a large increase in compulsory saving, which, as you would expect, results in a large decrease in personal liberty. Alleviating the burden of the social security budget is a thankless but vital task for which real Tory stamina is required. It won't be done by financial sleight of hand, but the possibility of a really radical approach to spending, requiring large-scale removal or transferal of government functions, must also remain on the agenda. Last November, a brilliant and provocative Centre for Policy Studies pamphlet by Patrick Minford, Public Spending, a 20-year plan for reform, reminded us how far we still might go and how great the potential gains. The spending cuts he proposes would also lead to dramatic tax cuts with a big impact on growth. Whether Professor Minford's proposals are deemed acceptable or not, they are extremely valuable in illustrating the possibilities. So I welcome the determination of the Chancellor of the Exchequer to bring public spending below 40% of GDP. And I hope that at the next election, we will be equipped with plans to bring it down over a period of years by much more. Limited government doesn't mean weak government, only less government. This is shown by the courageous and far-reaching reforms which Michael Howard has been making in the criminal justice system. The strength of the opposition he faces from the vested interests shows he is right, almost as much as do the encouraging recent crime figures. But today, the main challenge to limited government comes not from within these shores at all, but rather beyond them, from the European Union. There is, of course, also a challenge to self-government, and the two are closely connected. The activity of the European Court which can only ultimately be checked by amending the European Communities Act itself, is increasingly undermining our judicial system and the sovereignty of our Parliament. Proposals are being made for common European defence, proposals which Michael Portillo has roundly and rightly attacked. They, too, are a threat to national independence. But most important, of course, is the proposed single European currency, which, as John Redwood has argued, would be a major step on the way to a single European nation. The Prime Minister will have the support of all of us who wish to see these dangerous and damaging proposals resisted and the present trends reversed as he argues Britain's case at the forthcoming Intergovernmental Council, and we look forward to a successful outcome. But vital as the issue of self-government is, it is limited government that concerns me today. For the European Union not only wishes to take away our powers, it wishes to increase its own. It wants to regulate our industries and labour markets, pontificate over our tastes, in short, to determine our lives. The Maastricht Treaty, which established a common European citizenship and greatly expanded the remit of the European Commission, shows the outlines of the bureaucratic superstate which is envisaged. And Maastricht is the beginning, not the end, of that process. Indeed, we are increasingly seeing the emergence of a whole new international political class. Some of them are politicians who failed in their own countries and so have tried their luck overseas. Some are officials who understand nothing of our British distinction between the legitimate powers of the elected and those of the unelected. Almost 50 years ago, the conservative journalist Combe Brogan wrote an incisive critique of the post-war Labour government with its arrogant bossiness and intrusive cack-handedness. He called it Our New Masters. The title is equally appropriate to the new European masters. And it's no surprise to me, as someone who always recognized the socialist destination of this Euro-federalist dream, that now the Labour Party welcomes it all so warmly. What they can't achieve in an independent, free enterprise Britain, they can hope to secure in a Euro-federalist Britain, whose people's instincts are ignored and whose parliamentary institutions are overridden. Self-government, limited government, our laws, our parliament, our freedom. These things were not easily won. And if we Conservatives explain that they are now in peril, they will not be lightly surrendered. In the Reeds of Runnymede, celebrating the signing of Magna Carta, Rudyard Kipling puts it like this, and I end with two verses from his great poem. At Runnymede, oh, hear the reeds at Runnymede. You mustn't sell, delay, deny a freeman's right or liberty. It wakes the stubborn Englishry. We saw 'em roused at Runnymede. And still when mob or monarch lays too rude a hand on English ways, the whisper wakes, the shudder plays across the reeds at Runnymede. And Thames, that knows the mood of kings and crowds and priests and such like things, rolls deep and dreadful as he brings their warning down from Runnymede.
Lady Thatcher, thank you for coming here tonight to talk to us. Thank you for coming to talk for the Centre for Policy Studies. It is the greatest honour and privilege to have you here, and I would like to thank you most sincerely. You've inspired us tonight in the same way that you've inspired us for the last 20 years. You've told us in no uncertain terms, with your usual clarity and sure vision of the philosophical basis of conservatism. And you've pointed out the perils of Labour in your usual startling and accurate way. We would ignore your advice at our peril. You've stiffened our backbone and the backbone of the party, and I know that out there in the country, Conservatives throughout Britain will feel fortified and inspired by your words. Thank you very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now invited by the Swiss Bank Corporation to a reception on the atrium in the second floor. Thank you very much.